just a quick summary of what went on last week. Last week we talked about basically the rise of Nazism. And this week we're going to talk about primarily, although not exclusively, of course, because everything is really interacted one with the other, let's talk about Hitler goes to war in Germany. And we'll leave really the bulk and the biggest part of the Holocaust we'll leave for the latter two sections, because I don't think that we would do it really, give the cause its due by just running through it tonight in a half an hour. So the other ones, which we're basically calling part 3 will be the final solution, and then part 4, which I've always found to be interesting, is that since it does give us a challenge in faith, because you know what, after seeing 6 million people being innocent people dying as Jews, I thought it would be interesting to discuss faith after the Holocaust. I mean, how it really affects us, and how we really as survivors, even though we might not have had anybody there at the time, but how it really affects us and how we can carry on doing that. So last week we discussed basically the rise of this man called Adolf Hitler, and how he started out as a failed artist, was a veteran in World War I, rose up quickly in the Nazi Party. We talked about how they called the Nazi Party the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, and in short it was called Nazis. How they had campaigned and lost bitterly in 28. They only got about 4% of the vote, but they were in constant mode of campaigning and more campaigning and more campaigning, and eventually through a series of manipulations and what's called bedroom diplomacy, Hitler was able to ascend to the chancellorship in January of 1933. Hitler had always insisted that he was not going to take Germany by force. I mean, although that he couldn't have at that point in 1933, it wasn't a matter that he could have and he decided not to, he just simply could not, but there was an active and a strong campaign to do it legally. It means to win the ballots of the German people and to ascend to the leadership as a true chancellor appointed by the president. The president at that time was von Hindenburg. Von Hindenburg was we mentioned last week, was a World War I veteran, very well respected by the German people, but he was not a very good politician. I mean, Hitler had manipulated him all the way up to eventually when Hindenburg appointed him chancellor. And we talked about the inner things of what happened with Schleicher and with von Papen, and how Hitler made a midnight pact with von Papen to get Schleicher. Schleicher resigned, and that's how Hitler ended up being the chancellor in 1933. He immediately called for elections in March of 1933, and he received 17 million votes. 17 million votes at that time represented 44% of the vote, which did not give him a majority in the Reichstag. He wanted a majority and needed a majority to enact all the laws which he wanted to do. So he formed a coalition with a small conservative party, and shortly afterwards, by the end of March, the beginning of April, Hitler already was in power. He was already the chancellor, and he had a majority in the Reichstag. I mean, this already was followed, the burning of the Reichstag, I mean, as we talked about last week. Hitler quickly, during that time in the spring and summer of 1933, he quickly outlawed the Communist Party. He set up Dachau as a concentration camp, and he basically now began to implement his philosophy and everything that he wrote in that book in the 20s called the Mein Kampf, which he now had the power to perpetrate right now. So Hitler's first order of business was to consolidate power within Germany. I mean, this was not his forte. I mean, he didn't want to be, he always pictured himself as a big picture person. He didn't want to get involved in the nitty-gritty administrative issues of what the Nazi Party was going to have to do to actually run a country. So how Hitler actually ultimately set it up was, as we discussed last week, total overlay of one department over another. There was absolutely, I mean, if someone had actually studied the formation of the Nazi governmental departments, it would look completely chaotic. Hitler was removed Very few of the orders he gave came directly from him. He allowed his subordinates, at least within the interior issues, to call their own shots. And he made one guy, like we talked about, education and health, and the other guy health and railroads, and the other guy railroads and the weather, and the other guy whatever, whichever it was, he kept overlaying and giving people double jobs, and there was absolutely no coordination among the Nazis in the lower echelons. But he never wanted to get involved in the individual. But at this particular time in 33, Hitler needed to consolidate power, because there were, even though that he had won a plurality at the votes, I mean he had the majority of the Reichstag members were him, he did not automatically disband the cabinet. Actually, there was only 3 members of the cabinet that were actually Nazis. Himself, of course, as chancellor, he had put Göring in there, the number 2 Nazi, and then there was a 3rd Nazi. That was it. The rest of the cabinet he allowed to be non-Nazi members. He wanted to deal primarily and initially with 4 issues he had to deal with quickly on in this consolidation process. One was the economy, because as you remember from last week, Hitler rose to power based upon the economy. It's the economy, stupid. Do things ever change? No. They over and over again, you're going to hear the same thing. I don't care if it's Adam Smith, if it's Karl Marx, it's Adolf Hitler. It doesn't make any difference. It's always the same thing. If people have money in their pocket and they have a chicken in their pot and their stomachs are full, you're in. If they're hungry and there's no jobs and you can't feed your family and you come home every night to starving children, your job is in what we call jeopardy. You're in big trouble. So Hitler knew the first thing he has to do, one of the first things, is he's going to have to deal with the economy. And the way you're going to deal with the economy is how? What's the easiest and quickest way to get out of a depression? Is going to war. Go to war. He figures he's going to go to war. He had a small problem with that, because A, he wasn't ready to go to war. The army itself was not a very well-trained army, and there was actually, through the Treaty of Versailles, which we mentioned a number of times before, that they didn't allow him to have an army. I mean, Germany was basically cut off at its knees. So he had to implement a program that he was going to get the army up and running. Number 2 was he had to deal with the communists, because in his ideology of what he wrote in Mein Kampf was that the enemy, the true enemy, was not liberals, was not Democrats, it was none of these things. It was absolutely Judeo-Bolshevism. Because in his mind, who was behind the Bolsheviks? Jews. That was it. Bar none, Jews were behind the communists every step of the way. And he had to get rid of the communists. So within Germany itself, he dealt 2 ways with the communists. A, he outlawed political party and forbade it to be communist. B, any communist who actually was bold enough to proclaim himself a communist got a one-way ticket to Dachau. So this way, even though that in the last election of March of 33, the communists were able to get close to 9% of the vote, and this was after being forbidden, they couldn't campaign, they had no money, they had no ways of getting their message out, they still garnered 9% of the vote. I mean, which was incredible to think about that. I mean, you talk about a country of 60 million people. If let's say Hitler got 44%, then that represented 17 million. So you're talking about close to maybe 40 million people voted. 9% was close to 4 million people voted for the communists. So it was a sizable chunk of Germans that A, voted communist, and B, that rejected Hitler outright. So the communists you had to deal with. B, and this is really a subject that really has to be talked about in great length, although since we're just touching bits and pieces, but there's a million books that deals with this. The churches. How did Hitler deal with religion within Germany? And specifically, there were two main churches within Germany. A, Catholic, the Catholic Church, and B, primarily the Protestant churches. Now, Hitler himself was born Catholic. Okay, he was a nominal Catholic. Okay. In his worldview, in his big worldview, Hitler was kind of schizophrenic when it came to religion. Because just like everything else, which he was later going to manipulate and work to his own advantage, he felt he could do the same thing with the churches. So the Catholic Church, in July of 33, this is barely 6 months after Hitler had already come to power, the Catholic Church sent our good friend, which would later become the Pope Pius XII, to Germany, to Berlin, to sign a Concordat with Hitler. The first power, even though at that time the Vatican was not anymore a temporal power, they didn't have an army or anything like that, but they were the first ones to come to Berlin in July of 33, and they signed. He was at that time the Secretary of State of the Vatican, sent by the Pope to sign a Concordat. The Concordat basically read that Hitler would allow the Catholic Church to be independent, to run its own business, that there would be sort of freedom of religion, and Hitler was willing to do that because right now he was looking for friends, and he was not looking to start any kind of squabble, but he signed it, and immediately, as soon as the guy left, he immediately broke the Concordat. He absolutely broke the Concordat. He said he forbade the Catholic Church, and anybody that was against him, he put immediately to Dachau. So he was an expert at doing this. This is one of the things that Hitler was. He would sign a treaty, and then he would break the treaty. The Protestant church was much more difficult to deal with. They were a stronger church, and of course among the Catholic pastors you had some that were extremely pro-Nazi. Now who did Hitler appeal to? If you think about it, 17 million votes in a country of 60 million people, who did Hitler appeal to? Hitler appealed to veterans, people that remembered World War I. So we're talking about barely 20 years since the Treaty of Versailles. So if you were, let's say, 25, so now you're 45 years old. 45, so people from 45 to 65 who fought in the war or could have been soldiers in the war backed Hitler. Because what was it? It was a humiliation. World War I was a stinking stench on a proud nation like Germany. It was a stench, and they hated it. So they backed him. The veterans backed him. People that were out of work backed him. They had nothing to lose, so why not? If Hitler was going to give them jobs, they backed him. And many of the people, we talked about last week about a very interesting German pastor by the name of Martin Niemöller. Eventually, Niemöller was the guy who wrote, first they came for the Jews and no one spoke up. I didn't speak up because I wasn't Jewish. Then they came for the communists. I didn't speak up because I wasn't communist. Then they came for the homosexuals. I didn't speak up because I'm paraphrasing. I'm sure if you went to this thing. But down the line, and then when they came for me, there was no one left to speak up for me. Now here was a perfect example of what happened in Germany. Niemöller himself, in the beginning of Hitler's rise, was a staunch Nazi. Now you might say, could you believe this? A guy that wrote so beautiful, and bemoaned the fact that he didn't speak up. He was a Nazi. Why? Because he was one of those pastors that remembers World War I, fought in World War I, and was happy that Hitler rose to power. Because what Hitler was bringing back was what Germany always wanted, was a backbone, was to be able to stand up to the world and look themselves in the mirror without feeling bad. Okay, so his racial policies maybe people were ashamed of. Okay, they weren't, but you know what? If David Duke runs in this country, and he runs and he wins a majority of being an elected governor in Louisiana, what are the people in Louisiana going to say? Okay, he's a little bit of a Michiganer, but basically his program is correct. You know what? We need jobs as Americans. Is that true? Of course. We need to give the white people the jobs. Yeah, of course. Why not? Okay, so he's a little Samish when it comes to the Jews and other minorities, but you can throw out the baby with the bathwater, and that's the way they felt about him. So Niemöller and his chevra, Niemöller and a whole bunch of pastors joined the Nazi party and actually protected and supported Hitler in this time. At a time when Hitler needed the churches to come, because you know what, you can't buy this kind of popularity. When every pastor in Germany, or at least a majority of pastors, are getting up on Sunday and they're saying, look at what we elected, whoa, fantastic, Hitler is a man of the people, look at all of this, you can't even buy that kind of publicity. And this is how he fell in. Eventually there would be a split within the Protestant church. Again, you could go through this, there's many books written upon this, and and Niemöller was arrested in, I think in 34, he was arrested, sent to Dachau, and spent till 45 in Dachau. For 9 years he was liberated by the Allies in Dachau. So we had three issues that we're dealing with now. The economy, which we all know what Hitler's plan was, how to deal with the economy, which we're going to get to in a minute. 2, the churches, and Hitler divided, and again, anybody that said anything against Hitler immediately was arrested, you'd never seen, so your pastor could be there on Sunday, and by next Sunday you have a new pastor. And when you asked, where's the other pastor? You also went missing. That's like the story of, in Russia, because we're going to see a lot of parallels between Stalin and Hitler. In Russia, one day, the commissar got up there and they said, he gave a speech, and the guy stood up there and says, yes, Abramov. So the guy says, where is the meat that you promised us? He says, it's coming. Next week, they have another meeting, and the guy gives a speech to Commissar, and then this time it's Israelov that picks up his hand. So he says, Israelov, you also want to know where the meat is? He says, no, I just want to know where Abramov is. And that was the story in Germany at that time. So basically the Nazis, as we're going to see in a little while, dealt on two forefronts of how they were going to attack the people. Attack them, not physically, but attack this issue of gaining support within the German people. And third, and probably fourth, and probably the most important element that Hitler needed to win over was the army. Now, he had a small problem dealing with the army. Why? First of all, he himself had no background. I mean, he was a corporal. So he did not that he came as a famous general, he fought wars, he fought all of these things. But B, he also had what was then called the SA, the brown shirts. Now, we had talked about them a little bit last week. They had almost become a quasi-army within the country, because they protected Hitler, they protected the Nazi leadership, they were around beating up the communists. I mean, they were literally like a bunch of thugs with organized thuggery. It wasn't just haphazard, organized thuggery that orders came from the highest echelons of the Nazi party. Now you have several thousand of these members. This is not a little four guys with a minion. These guys are an organized SA little army. The army themselves didn't want to do anything. They had nothing to do with the SA, because they prided themselves as being German. You know how German are. They pride themselves as being proper German officers. And what are these guys are a bunch of thugs. So Hitler, in order to get rid of the SA, had to somehow incorporate them within the normal army. But how do you take thugs and put them into a normal army? Because if these guys, their specialty was brutality, they went around with batons and bats and knives and guns and just literally beat up people. So Hitler formed, together with Hermann Göring, what we know today as the Gestapo. The Gestapo and the SS became the security vehicle for Nazi Germany. And on top of this organization, he placed Himmler. Right? Himmler became the head of the Gestapo. What did he do with Ernest Röhm? Ernest Röhm was a devoted loyalist of Hitler, so he had him executed in June of 1934. Believe me, he had no loyalty to anybody. Nobody, as long as you served his purpose, you were okay. The moment he didn't need you, or he felt that you were even in the slightest, you were somehow a roadblock to his complete, absolute authority, he absolutely killed you on the spot, and this is what happened to Ernest Röhm. Röhm agitated, because he already realized what was going to be going on. He agitated, arrested, and executed in 1934, together with our good friend who we mentioned last week, von Papen, who Hitler made this midnight charade to get the chancellery. On August 2nd of that year of 1934, Hindenburg died. Now, why is this important to know why Hindenburg died? Because if there was anybody within Germany that had any sense of credibility, it was still Hindenburg. And with Hindenburg's death, Hitler took upon himself and closed and actually combined the two offices of presidency and the chancellor. Until then, there was two. There was a president, Hindenburg, and Hitler was a chancellor. Hitler now became the president and the chancellor, and he took to himself the name of Der Führer, the ultimate leader of Nazi Germany and of the German people. There was absolutely no opposition. By this time, there was no other political parties allowed. There's everything. He controlled every single aspect. The television, the radio, the media, movies, everything was controlled by the Nazi infrastructure from A to B. Absolutely everything was controlled. The Nazis went on an unbelievable and ferocious campaign, both ideologically and physically. Terror. The media was controlled by this little, I don't know what I'm trying to control the words that I use tonight, because I want to clean it up for the miners in the room. I know there's some miners here tonight. By this little guy by the name of Goebbels. Goebbels was his minister of propaganda. And what they churned out from the years of 1933 to 1939, because those were the years that Hitler was preparing to go to war. It took him a while. So early years, he wasn't thinking about right away going, but those years, what Hitler did was a constant stream of propaganda. You turned on the radio, you turned on the television, all you heard was positive, positive, positive stuff about the Nazi Party. How the Nazi Party was creating jobs. How the Nazi Party was cleaning up the streets. How the Nazi Party was putting the bus lines on time. How the Nazi Party had helped do this. How the Nazi Party, constantly you were bombarded. You didn't hear anything else. All the songs were extremely controlled. All you heard was patriotic songs, things about Germany, things about this, and again the vitriolic against the Jews and against the Versailles Treaty and against the Allied powers that put Germany into this thing. And day after day after day, night after night, the German people were fed with this kind of propaganda. Relentless. They didn't know, it wasn't like, you know what, okay, we're going to, let maybe there'll be one paper that would be absolutely, it was under the punishment of death. I mean, if you thought that you were going to publish an opposition paper, absolutely you would be shot immediately. There was absolutely nothing to talk about. And how do we deal with people that were against the Nazi regime? Pure terror. Pure terror. And we talked a little bit last week of the tactics of the Gestapo. What the Gestapo did is, many of them did not walk with military uniforms. If you've ever seen the movies, the Nazi movies, the Gestapo was always these guys with these long trench coats. They're the most sinister looking people. They find the most sinister looking guys because these were the most devilish, devious, inhumane people that you could possibly imagine. I mean, they had absolutely no regard for anything. And this is what Hitler did. He took the worst of the worst, the thugs of the thugs, the most brutal people, and put them into the Gestapo, into the SS. Now, Hitler prided himself on military. He loved the military. We talked about last week that he felt good in the military. When he felt at home was among military soldiers. Why? Because there was order. You know, everybody wore a uniform, and if you notice the parades, and that was another thing that the Nazis were able to do, put on tremendous parades. If you watch the old Nazi movies, hundreds of thousands of people all standing there in a straight line. You go to Schwartz's Bakery in LA, 6 Jews can't stand in a straight line. They tell you, start a line here, the line goes like a snake. You can't get it. 900,000 Germans goose-step together. Boom, boom, boom. Not one step out of line. It's unbelievable what the Nazis were able to do. Put together these parades, these marches, these banners, and Hitler always at the forefront. Hitler was there speaking constantly on the radio, and he was a mesmerizing orator. He was unbelievable. I mean, his high-pitched voice, his screaming. I mean, he captured the imagination, literally captured the imagination of the German people when you have constant bombardment of this stuff, of this kind of stuff. It's interesting that Hitler's rise to power came almost too easy. Later on, one of the guys who chronicled the rise of Hitler, and he himself was a Nazi sympathizer, wrote in his newspaper, it was no victory because the enemies were lacking. There was no one to stand up against him. I mean, all the way up the ladder, we noticed that was absolutely no one was going to say one thing against Hitler. I mean, this was from a small little band of ideologues, of racist murderers, now have taken over this country with nary a bullet being shot. I mean, I've beaten up a few communists here and there, but it was nothing. It was absolutely almost nothing. The Gestapo worked, as I mentioned last week, in sinister ways. I mean, one of the ways they would work is they would never arrest a guy during the day. They would always usually do this at night. They would come to the apartment buildings. If you ever travel to Berlin or other places, you know, within Germany and Munich and these places, if you didn't travel, you obviously pictures of them. Many of these places were not big estates. Many of them were urban centers. People lived in apartment buildings. In those days, apartment buildings, had wooden places. It was always 2, 3 in the morning. You heard boots running up and banging on the door, smashing down the door, people screaming and crying. And believe me, what this did is not only threw a terror into the family that the father was dragged out of, but it was absolutely threw a terror in the whole apartment building. Everybody knew that in apartment 2G, Muller was just taken, or someone else was just taken, and that caused a terror because Hitler had no compunction about punishing the entire family. So if you were a sympathizer, communist sympathizer, or whatever, it would make absolutely no difference. He would go after you, after your family, grandparents. It doesn't make a difference, and that was terrifying for the German people. People later asked, why didn't they stand up to Hitler? Why? Why? Because you're a single guy living in Huntington Beach, and all of a sudden everybody around you is being arrested. Well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You have a family. You have to protect your family. You have to protect your children. You have brothers and sisters. You shut up. You don't pick your hand up, because the guy who picks his hand up is immediately greeted with a bullet in the head. And they had no problems doing that. And that's the way they garnered absolute control of Germany. Now, once Hitler was able to feel confident that within his own house, I mean within Germany itself, he had control, then he set his mind on the bigger picture, as we said before. He was, besides everything else, you see, it's very easy in history to write him off as a madman. Because ultimately, at the end, he does turn into a madman. But he was a calculated madman. Just to give you an idea, in 1933, the Allies already had seen what was going on here. And in Britain, interestingly enough, and we're going to talk about this a little bit in detail, within Britain, there was almost not a sympathetic view of Germany, but a sympathetic view that Germany was mishandled after World War I. That the Treaty of Versailles was somehow abusing to Germany. A lot of British people felt that literally the powers took advantage of. Now, you could imagine, if in Britain they were feeling this way, what do you think they were feeling like in Germany? In Germany, they were absolutely hated. And Hitler made sure that every time they get out there, the words Treaty of Versailles was prominently displayed. Look at what we have to go through the Treaty of Versailles. Look how unfair it is. Look what they're doing to us. We are Germans. We are proud. The Allies decided they're going to call a Geneva disarmament conference in 1933. Let's stop him early. What do we have to wait for? Let's stop him early. Hitler shows up to this Geneva conference. The Allies are sitting there. Britain, Germany, Hitler, others. And Hitler puts out a proposal. This is the brilliance of this guy. He puts out a proposal. He says, you know what? You want to talk about disarmament? I'm ready. I'm going to be the first guy in Europe to disarm. I'm going to put away everything. I'm going to disband the army on one condition. Everybody does likewise. Okay? France, Britain, we want to disarm completely? Make Europe guns free? I'm willing to do it. Now, the Allies think about this. They look at Hitler, they look at each other, they say, are we nuts or something? We're going to disarm with this madman sitting in the center of them? So they refuse. They refuse, he calls their bluff. You're refusing to disarm. Why? Because you have intent against Germany. He goes back to Germany, and the next speech he absolutely gives, it shows that the Allies refused to make peace with Germany. This is already 15 years after the end of World War I. Therefore, it's time, my friends, that we need to do what we need to do. We need to do. Now, what do we need to do? When Hitler starts on this campaign, where is he going? I mean, you're sitting in Germany. What, all of a sudden, you're going to say, boo, I'm attacking? No. What you do is you go slowly. Because what World War I did was, besides the fact that he almost emasculated Germany completely, World War I caused a tremendous upheaval within the indigenous people. I thought the Allies, last week, as I mentioned, the Allies played risk with Europe. They made every single country completely discombobulated. So Poland, they carved out of one piece. Even though Poland took parts of Ukraine, they made an independent Poland. Poland had there was no reason why it got this section. But you know what? The Allies decided this is what we want to do. They carved out of Czechoslovakia out of nowhere. Czechoslovakia, they gave it a piece of Germany. They gave them they incorporated close to 4 million ethnic Germans within the Sudetenland. Now, when you do that, what happens? You're asking yourself for big trouble. Absolutely big trouble. I mean, just imagine for a second that if the United States of America was to annex 100 miles of Canada and incorporate all of the Canadians within America, it'd be a big problem. There'd be such a revolution, in a few years the Canadians would not take this. They would bring their hockey sticks and they would make a tumult. They would protest, I'm telling you, they're curling sticks, they would protest. Because what you're doing is you're causing a tremendous, within themselves you're causing a fifth column. And Hitler understood this. And he knew that they were native Germans, ethnic German. Both were France, I think in Alsace-Lorraine, both in Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Austria, which was basically in the heart, sitting right next to Germany, there was a tremendous sympathy towards Hitler, because where did he come from? Austria. And you don't have to teach them about anti-Semitism, because they're good anti-Semites just all by themselves. So he had allies within Austria itself, and that was going to be the first test case, was going to be Austria. And all of these things, Hitler was later on going to use every single event that we could possibly use, every single upheaval, and he was going to do that. In Germany itself, he began also at the same time thinking about foreign policy. He began to think about racial policy. As I mentioned to you before, I'm going to deal with this in greater length in our next lecture, because it's so unbelievable, and you have to ask yourself so many what ifs. What if this would have done? What if that could have been done? What if that it's you, even though you might read it a million times and you know the situation, it's still unbelievable. And it can't really do it justice. But I just want to go over for a few minutes, because there were really three distinct stages in Hitler's war against the Jews. When Hitler first came to power in 33 to 35, is what we called legal discrimination against the Jews. Basically, he outlawed Jews from being doctors, he outlawed Jews from being lawyers, and he outlawed Jews from any form of education. You couldn't be professors, you couldn't be teachers, because God forbid you're going to taint the Aryan children's minds. So for 2 years, basically the Nazis legally discriminated against Jews. Hitler's initial policy, and it's so easy to look at hindsight 2020, his initial policy was to push the Jews out of Germany. Literally to get them out of Germany. It wasn't about killing them, it wasn't about exterminating them, it was literally to get them out of his sight. He got sick at the sight of looking at one. Literally got sick at the sight. So he wanted them out of Germany. So the first 2 years, it was legal. You know what? Okay, you were a doctor, today you're not a doctor. Okay, there's worse things that could happen. Today you're a lawyer, you're not a lawyer. Okay, fine, find another job. From 35 to 38 is when they passed the Nuremberg race laws. Now it's one thing when you're forbidden to go into work as a professional. You can't be an accountant, a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, a professor. This is the time that Einstein came to the United States during these years. The Nuremberg race laws was already ratcheted up one level. That level already, Hitler forbade Jews from any rights. He stripped them all of their citizenship. Now, telling a guy you're fired is one thing. Okay, you go home, they don't want doctors. Okay, you know what? I'll be a laborer. I'll be something else. Fine. I'll sew, make matzahs. We'll make Hanukkah menorahs. We'll do something. But when he tells you, you know what? You're not a citizen. You're nothing. You're not an entity here in Germany. And these were people that have lived there. You know how long Jews have lived in Germany? Close to 1,000 years. They were there for 1,000 years. Jews lived in Germany. I mean, we're talking about back to at the beginning of the millennium, there were Jews there. Stripped them, forbade intermarriage, forbade interdating with Jews, made them a people that they don't exist. They're not people. They're vermin. And that the highlight of that era was Kristallnacht of November of 1938, because Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, as they called it, was the beginning of organized terror against the Jews. Until then, there were boycotts of Jewish stores. There were, all of these things. Jews were stripped of their citizenship. But in 38 of November, the government set out on a policy to terrorize the Jewish people. And that night, many tens of Jews were killed. Shuls were destroyed. Businesses, homes were burned. The Jews now saw that the end. This is it. But this was nothing compared with what was going to happen. Because until this time, his policy was push them out. But when the war started with Poland, it already became much different. They implemented what they were later going to call the final solution to the Jewish problem. And I don't want to get into it, because once you start talking about the final solution, it's going to take one. So let's leave it for now. We'll take questions maybe later on about the situation of the Jews, and let's talk about Hitler's foreign policy to start off with. Hitler's ultimate goal in foreign policy was to establish a 1,000-year Reich. The rise of the Third Reich was going to last for 1,000 years. And he saw himself as the Führer, the mastermind, the leader of the master race that was going to take over Europe. He was willing to see 4 separate empires in the world. He was in the United States. He wasn't going to attack initially. had nothing, didn't want, said America could be on its own. Britain, he said Britain could, if they wanted, they could be on their own, keep their empire. And Japan in the east. But everything else was going to be under Nazi domination, and certainly Europe. America, he felt, was going to collapse on its own because it was so decadent and so immoral that it's going to fall. So he didn't have to worry about it. Once America falls, he'll just walk in there. He doesn't need any more. Britain, he respected, and Japan, he was a natural ally of the Japanese. That was his ultimate plan. What's he going to do about it? So Hitler begins in 1935 to rearm. Now, most of this rearming was absolutely a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. In the Treaty of Versailles, the Allies made it absolutely clear to him that under no circumstances should he have an army. So the first thing he does, okay, he sets up what they called then the Luftwaffe. What the Luftwaffe? The Air Force. He establishes an Air Force. Okay? Then all of a sudden he starts a naval agreement. He signs a naval agreement and he starts building ships to build a navy. You know, one of the big ships that later were going to be sunk was called the Bismarck. They have this whole story about how the Bismarck was sunk. Ultimately, how did he end up getting a Bismarck? How do you build such ships? Because here now, he was going to start building the naval. He instituted what we used to have in the United States of America, a draft. Anybody of fighting age, anybody that you could fight, came in. Now there's an interesting book about the draft, which is worth picking up if you have a chance. It's called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. I know Charlotte, I know we talked about, did you see it? We talked about it in Talmud class. A professor I think at Yale University wrote a book, did some research, that in Hitler's army there was between 250,000 and maybe 500,000 soldiers that were Jewish. Now, Jewish was not halachically Jewish. We're not talking about them with a Jewish mother with a circumcision. No, we're not talking about that kind of Jewish, but Hitler's definition of Jew, which was 1/4. If you had a parent, a grandparent that was Jewish, you were Jewish. And they were incorporated in his army. So in the beginning, Hitler allowed these people to join the army. Later on, and this is the sick psychology about Hitler. Later on, when he began to show discrimination and harassment of Jews at home, and people would write to their sons in the army that, you know, they're getting all of this harassment, and then the army would come to the colonel or come to the lieutenant, to the captain, and say, look, my mother in Berlin is a Jew and she's being harassed and she's being hurt, you know, do something about it. And they were getting more and more complaints. So what did Hitler do? So a normal person who wants to win a war would say, you know what, I've got 500,000 of these soldiers, maybe I should appease them. No, he fired them. He couldn't take the fact, he absolutely could not take the fact that he was somehow going to protect a Jew. Because that was what was going to make it necessary. If you want to keep these Jewish soldiers happy, you were going to have to protect the families at home, and he just couldn't see that. He absolutely could. He was willing to sacrifice 250,000 soldiers not to protect Jews, absolutely to have nothing to do with them. But even though that still, even after everything is said and done, there were still Jews in the army. After he got rid of everybody. It's a very interesting book, if someone is interested in the subject, you know, to pick it up. Then he militarized the Rhineland. The Rhineland was going to be his place where he was going to lift off at war. Now this was an absolutely direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. What did the Allies do? When Hitler started to remilitarize the Rhineland and to gather all of these soldiers, you know what the Allies did? They got together, did nothing. They did absolutely nothing. They said Hitler, they called up, and then they hung up the phone quickly before he got to the phone. Like, you know, if you do something, you call up and then you hang up the phone. That's what, absolutely nothing. You know what this showed Hitler? This showed Hitler a very important lesson. You can push them. You can absolutely push the Allies. And not only did it show Hitler this, but later on we're going to see how it proved to Stalin. Because Hitler would keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And 5, and maybe even most important of all, was at this particular time within Europe, there was a civil war going on in Spain between the Republicans and the nationalists. The Republicans were an consortium of a number of different people, the communists and the young and the labor unions, and all of these things were fighting on the Republican side. It's interesting, okay, on the Republican side. On the nationalist side was led by who? Francisco Franco, okay? Marshal Generalissimo Francisco Franco, a fascist, who together with his buddy from Italy, Mussolini, made up the three fascists that were running in Germany at that time. Hitler, Franco, and Mussolini. The difference between Franco, Mussolini, and Hitler is that, see, there is a study being done that, you know what, if you take it, the difference between the Catholic countries and the Protestant countries, the Protestant countries had much more anti-Semitism. Mussolini and Franco did not share the same hatred to the Jews. I mean, maybe they hated the Jews, they couldn't stand the Jews, you know, but it wasn't with this psychological, with the sickness that they were going to get rid of them. Franco, as a matter of fact, Franco protected the Jews. When Hitler said to him, "Send me the Jews," he said to him, "Listen, Hitler, we had for many years 500,000 Jews living within France. If now you're going to tell me who is Jewish, I might be Jewish according to your definition." So Franco resisted from sending the Jews to Hitler. But what Hitler did do is he sent army and the officers to support and to fight on Franco's side. And he did it for one purpose. Why? Because many of them were not trained since World War I. He had young guys coming up. They needed training, so he couldn't fight in the heartland of Europe. So he sent them to Spain to start their war, and then to come home, and they would make up the ultimate the backbone of the German army. Then an unbelievable thing happens. In 1936, there's an Olympics. And the Olympics are given to none other than Germany. In 1936. This is already after Hitler had already passed the Nuremberg race laws. This is after Hitler had already started rearmament. This is after Hitler had already transgressed a number of times the Treaty of Versailles. He gets to host the Olympics in front of the eyes of the world. And the Nazi propaganda machine starts to churn out more and more and more. What was Hitler's purpose? Hitler's purpose was going to be to show to the world, look at this. Clean streets, no crime, industrial people, athletes, right? Little did he know that Americans were going to send Jesse Owens. See, if he knew that they were going to send Jesse Owens to Germany to race, he would have probably canceled the Olympics. But they sent Jesse Owens, and Jesse Owens came back as a hero in America and embarrassed the Fuhrer. But that was only a sidebar to the world. And we know this lady Lenny, you know, what was her name? What was her name? The photographer, the movie maker, made the will, you know, the triumph, the will to triumph, many movies, and they showed it, and the Nazi party and Nazi Germany was looking spit and clean in 1936. And the world saw, you know, this is a guy, okay, he's a little bit mishoga, and he has queer ideas about the Jews, but who did like the Jews? Who liked the Jews? You think they liked the Jews in Poland? Did they like the Jews in Lithuania? Did they like the Jews in Russia? No one liked the Jews. So in America, okay, you know what? But there was, in America itself, there was a big Nazi party, a big following. And not only was there a big following in America, there was a tremendous amount of isolationists that said to the United States that under no circumstances are we going to go to war. Our big hero, Charles Lindbergh himself, of German descent, was a tremendous, if he was not a Nazi sympathizer, which I believe he was, he certainly was an isolationist to keep America out of war. It's not our business. What's happening in Europe is over the pond. It's independent. It's his business, Hitler's. We don't have to worry about it. Don't say anything. Hitler was literally winning the war on PR. In the hearts and the minds of the people. He was a little crazy, yes, but he was winning, and now was when he was crouched like a tiger, and he was ready to explode right now. Hitler set his eyes on the first country, which was going to be Austria. Why Austria of all of the countries? Because within Austria itself, he found two natural allies. Anti-Semites, which shared his view about the Jews, and second, German nationalism. Now don't forget that Austria was really where World War I had started. Because of the breakup of the Serbs and the Krauts and, you know, and then all of this, Hitler went, and what he called then was the Anschluss. The union of Austria begged the Allies, literally begged the Allies, Germany and France, which were the two allies, to help them Not a peep. As a matter of fact, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, himself was a proponent. He agreed with the Anschluss. He wrote, yeah, why? Hitler wants to take Austria. Let him take Austria. There's anyways a big population of Germans there. Ooh, anybody's going to miss Austria? If today Austria went off the map, would anybody miss Austria today? Maybe the Austrians. But if you think about it, no one in the world, what is it? It doesn't make watches like Switzerland. It doesn't have the Swiss Army knives. It doesn't have the French chefs. Austria, forget about it. Hitler annexes Austria. Okay, he annexes Austria with nary a peep from the world. Hitler himself tells his generals that he himself is shocked. He can't believe this. How could he do this without anybody ride? The guy rides into Vienna, and in Vienna, always the same thing. If you look at the pictures of him riding into Vienna, you know what you see? Every banner is a swastika. Every person on the street is saluting Hitler. Everybody is glad to have Hitler in town. You think everybody was glad to have Hitler in town? Absolutely not. But the Germans went in beforehand, cleaned out all of the opposition. So by the time Hitler showed up, all you see is smiling, happy people in Austria welcoming the liberator. The great liberator of Europe is finally here and we greet him. And from the West, garnished. Now what if, if you're a historian and you go back, you want to play games with yourself, had France and Britain at that time, because America was kind of out of it, but it had Britain and France, who were the quote-unquote the protectors of Europe. They had promised Czechoslovakia, they had promised Poland, they had signed treaties with these countries that they were going to stand firm. Had they stood firm and said to Hitler at that time, we're going to go to war, who knows what would have happened? Probably he would have gone to war anyways, because this was not a guy that was going to stand back and say, you know what, I don't care. But in 38, had they made a stand, they could have caught him by surprise. Who knows what? They could have bombed a number of different things. But Neville Chamberlain went on this one path, and this one word that would come to eat up Europe was called appeasement. He was going to appease him. Okay, once Hitler went into Austria, and he had this unbelievable success, and he was pinching himself because he couldn't believe it. He said, okay, now is the next. Where was the next place going to be? Czechoslovakia. He was going to hit Czechoslovakia next. I told you, Czechoslovakia, after World War I, Czechoslovakia now doesn't exist anymore. You know why Czechoslovakia doesn't exist anymore? Because Czechoslovakia was a bastard state. What does that mean? I don't mean anything against the Czech people. But it was made up of different people put together, hopscotch and slop after World War I. Today, you have Slovenia, you have the Czech Republic, you have this, you have that. If everybody broke into their own little group. Beforehand, everybody was under Czechoslovakia. The same thing is true about Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia under Marshal Tito, everybody kept quiet. No one said a word, and we had peace in Yugoslavia. The moment communism blew out, what happened to Yugoslavia? Complete civil war. Complete civil war, because that's the way it works in Europe. You have these little states, these little city states or country states that don't want to be coexist. So in Sudetenland, there was 3.5 million Germans. Hitler sends in Nazi provocateurs into Sudetenland. And what they do is, they rally up, and all of a sudden there's a newsflash. German citizens are being attacked by Czechoslovakian nationalists. Oh, and they're crying out to Berlin, to Hitler, to help them. Here we are, we're being persecuted in Czechoslovakia. Hitler makes a protest with Britain and France, and says, well, I need to do something to protect these people. Britain fans know this is not true. Why? Who's going to attack the German population in Sudetenland? Hitler says, I want that piece of territory. I want to annex the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. They send immediately Chamberlain over to negotiate. Chamberlain comes in, Hitler sits there, the Munich Peace Treaty. Remember what? Say it, Marvin.
Peace in our time.
Peace in our time. Okay? They literally give Hitler, think about this, they literally give this guy a chunk of Czechoslovakia with the condition, with the absolute condition, and Hitler swears up and down on his mother's grave, and he signs on the dotted line that he's not going to attack Czechoslovakia. And the Allies sit there and they see this, and he's looking them straight in the eye. I mean, imagine this. This is after Hitler had already broken the treaty with the Vatican. This is after Hitler had broken a number of different treaties in the world and showed absolutely no respect for international law. They look at him and they say to him, yeah, we are going to now sign on the dotted line. The Munich Peace Conference comes out, Hitler gets Sudetenland, but Czechoslovakia is saved. Now the Czech government beforehand came to the British and to the French, and they said to the British and the French, please, we beg you, we don't know this madman is sitting on our doorstep. I mean, you know what, by now, you're not talking about a man without arms. We're talking about 1939 already over here. So he already has been in power 6 years. 6 years he's been in power already. 38 going into 39. And they say now that Hitler has eyes on Czechoslovakia. You've got to step in. And they say, don't worry about it. They're backing up Czechoslovakia. We're going to stand by you. There's absolutely nothing to talk about. Okay. They go home. Marvin said it. Peace in our time. Come back to England. Big bold letters in the London Times. Everybody's zufrieden. Chamberlain did a job. Yasher Koyach. Thank you very much. We were going to honor you with the Peace Prize. You held Hitler back. What does he do? He invades Czechoslovakia. He invades Czechoslovakia and takes Czechoslovakia. The Czechs are up in arms. Well, what can you do? You know, Hitler came in with panzer troops. These were not, I mean, he was rearming to the teeth. He came in with panzer troops, took over Czechoslovakia, and the West did what? Sat like this. No, but they did do something. They promised Poland, because Poland saw that they're next. Because why was Poland nervous? Poland was nervous because they knew that Hitler wanted them for one reason. What separated Germany from Russia? One country, Poland. That was it. Poland was the buffer between Russia and Germany. Now, Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin. I mean, if you think about how sick this is, I mean, this was his number one worst enemy. His whole ideology was based upon Judeo-Bolshevism. But he sat and he signed a non-aggression treaty with Stalin. And not only did he sign a non-aggression treaty with Stalin, he told Stalin that he's going to attack Poland. And as he attacks from the west, Stalin should attack from he's going to go east, Stalin should come from the west, and they'll split Poland down the middle. Okay, Stalin doesn't care. He's happy. Why not? What does he care? But even he was fooled. Little did he know that this madman was only doing this just to get Russia. Poland says, Britain and France say to Poland, don't worry, we are behind you 1,000,000%. Czechoslovakia, who cares, Czechoslovakia? It anyways was a country made up of, but Poland is a proud country. Poland is not any Czechoslovakia. Poland is not the Sudetenland. Poland is not Austria. Poland is Poland, 30 million people living in Poland. They say, don't worry. Hitler does the same thing. He sends in Polish soldiers, Nazis dressed up as Polish soldiers, to shoot a few Germans. The Germans claim, look, the Poles are attacking us. And I'll tell you that there was a lot of Germans living in Poland. My mother, who grew up in a small little town near Lodz. So if you look at the map, if you looked at a map of Poland, let's say this was a map of Poland, I should have a map of Poland. So this vast expanse here is Russia, here is Germany, and here's Poland in the middle. So Lodz was on the western side of Poland. My mother spoke fluent German. Fluent German. She was Polish 100%. But the influence within her town of Lodz was all German. I mean, my grandfather traveled to Germany, did business with Germans. I mean, you know, it was unbelievable. So that's why no one believed. I mean, when my mother heard that the Hitler was a Nazi, was going to go against the Jews, it didn't make any sense. The Jews had always dealt with the Germans. She still today speaks fluent German. Hitler undermined it and caused chaos within the border. Well, September 1st, 1939. Hitler in the middle of the one morning, September 1st, boom, attacks Poland. Now, when he attacked Poland, that already triggered off our response from the Allies. Because Britain and France said, now they're going to do something. But they did nothing. But what Poland did was they were going to fight Hitler. So this was what it was like. Hitler came in with a number, like what they called the blitzkrieg. I mean, he didn't do it quickly. I mean, slowly. He just overran them. In 1 month, the whole country was taken over. Absolutely taken over in 1 month. The Warsaw Ghetto The Warsaw Ghetto, which we will talk about in lesson number 3, held out longer than the Polish army held out. People who remember the war said they were coming over with these Panzer the tanks, and the Poles were riding on horses, cavalry. This was like a 1939 fighting against Custer in 1875. This is what it was like. They were ill-trained. There was absolutely no infrastructure in the Polish army, and the Germans ran over them like literally a knife through butter. A knife through butter, finished. What did Hitler see here? Hitler saw no one doing anything. He absolutely cannot believe this. No one is coming to any. He thought by now for sure he was going to have some kind of an opposition. Absolutely nothing. They had very few casualties. No, they did nothing. The Poles laid down their arms and have a good day. The one group that did fight was called the Partisans. There was a group called the Partisans, which later would be let back into into Poland with the Russian army. We'll get to that a little bit later on. So here all of a sudden is Hitler is sitting in the middle of Europe on top. It doesn't stop. What happens from October 1939, from October 39, this is already, he has captured Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. 3 countries independent, he has literally swallowed them up. Okay? From October 1939 to April of 1940, so it's a matter of 6 months, Hitler doesn't do anything. Hitler stops. In Britain, they call this the phony war because they were waiting. He was playing a game now. Hitler stopped. I mean, after eating up in a year, he ate up 3 countries, he doesn't do anything. All of a sudden, in April of 1940, he attacks he invades Norway, and he invades Denmark. Norway and Denmark were no match for him, and he immediately scurries down and attacks the Low Countries. He gets Belgium, and he gets Holland. And again, they were no match for the Germans. But then came the Maginot Line. And here's where Britain said, this is where we're going to stop him. Because the French, our good allies, the French, they were going to put up the resistance. You can't expect Poland or Holland or Belgium or Czechoslovakia, but the French had built their defense system on this line that's impenetrable. No way the Germans are going to get through. Okay, so the guns could only be pointed one way. So if you attack from the behind, you're finished. Go figure out that the French are not such good military tacticians. They make much better wine and brie. That they do good. But to fight in a war, they can't do for anything. In May of 1940, Hitler swoops down and attacks France. This already triggered off the bomb because Britain sent soldiers. Immediately crossed the channel and sent soldiers. The Germans were just too overpowering. The French can't fight. They were just absolutely too overpowering. And in a matter of a month, it was all over. Month, 2 months, 3 months, he already was sitting in Paris. Anyways, he never conquered the whole France anyways, Hitler. Hitler only took the first chunk, the northern part of France. The rest of France was run by this Vichy government. You know, they did that. The British were pinned down in Dunkirk. I mean, we all know what happened in Dunkirk. They pinned them down, and that night they sent over boats and fishing planes, whatever they can get. And I think 350,000 British troops went across the channel during the retreat from Dunkirk. Hitler was sitting all over Europe. In a matter of 2 years, with nary a fight, hardly a fight, Hitler was sitting now at the apex of his power. He had France, he had the Low Countries, he had the Scandinavian countries. He never attacked Sweden, but Sweden anyways was always neutral. He didn't attack Switzerland. Switzerland was always neutral. In the south, he had his buddy, what was his name over there? Mussolini attacked Greece, so they took Greece. Spain anyways was fascist with Franco. Europe was Hitler's, except for 2 countries, Britain and Russia. Now Russia was under the illusion that Germany was their allies. Germany was going to be friends of theirs. They had nothing to worry about. Fine. But Britain knew better. Operation Sea Lion is what they called the war that they were going to launch against Britain. He was unstoppable. I mean, you think about it. At this time in the fall of 1940, Hitler was unstoppable, unbelievable. What happens is they postpone it. They're going to bomb the living daylights out of Britain. What this is called the Battle of Britain. We all know what happens during May of 1940. The British come together in a very, very secretive 3-day cabinet meeting. And I think they make the most crucial decision in these 3 days that saved the war for the Allies. During these 3 days, they make a crucial decision that was going to save the war, I believe, for the Western Allies. And that is, they replaced Neville Chamberlain with Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill is an interesting guy that deserves, by himself, I gave this lecture, a little while ago on Churchill, a 2-part series a 1-part series on Winston Churchill. But it takes to talk a little bit about him, just a few minutes. Winston Churchill had a British father and an American mother. He was always fascinated with America. Churchill himself was a guy that was, fought wars. He went to the Boer War. He was a correspondent. He was a writer. He was a politician. He was also a speaker, a tremendous speaker. Winston Churchill in 1928, I believe, or 29, was commissioned to come to the United States to give 10 lectures here in the United States, at that time for the enormous sum of $30,000. He was going to give 10 speeches. His first speech was going to be in New York City. That night, as he's going, Winston Churchill always walked with 2 things, his bowler and a cigar. As he steps off the curb, he immediately gets hit by a New York taxi cab. As he's laying down on the street, okay, I'm telling you, this is a true story.
He came from the wrong direction.
He came from the wrong, exactly, he stepped on the curb, he got hit by a cab. As he's laying on the street and people ask him, "Who are you?" All he said was, "My name is Winston Churchill, British statesman." Who says that? Do you announce who you are? But in his mind, this is what my name is Winston Randolph Churchill, British statesman. That was it. His tour was cancelled because he couldn't move. He had broken his leg. He couldn't speak anymore. I don't know if he got the money. He was always out of money, Churchill. Was always out of money. Even though his father had money, but he has had money, down money, even though he was once the Chancellor of the Exchequer, but it doesn't make a difference. Now, in May of 1940, Churchill himself was an ardent anti-Nazi. I mean, before the war, of course, because he was in the opposition, was an ardent anti-Nazi. Hitler knew that he was going to be his biggest challenge. In 1936, Hitler sent an envoy to speak to Winston Churchill, even though Churchill was not the prime minister, to win him over, kind of win over Churchill. And Churchill told the Nazi envoy, "Tell your boss that anti-Semitism is a good starter, but a lousy finisher. So I have absolutely nothing to do and nothing to say with Adolf Hitler." In November of 1940, as France is being overrun, Chamberlain, who later on wrote in his memoirs that he made a huge mistake, he saw that appeasement, Hitler was a liar, and he went back on every treaty, but he was not the guy to lead. Winston Churchill now came into power. We all know, and we know when once the Nazis started bombing London, Churchill was everywhere. He was giving speeches, on the beaches and on the land. We will fight them, and we will fight them, and every speech has already been regurgitated and retold and rehashed, and all of that stuff. Hitler was stopped. Hitler was stopped, even though that he was now at the apex of his power. He postponed his Operation Sea Lion. He did not invade Britain. They fought on the seas. I mentioned to you before about the sinking of the Bismarck. Hitler was arrested. Not arrested in the sense of put into jail, but at least he was stopped. Hitler then made a crucial decision. After he decided that he was going to take Britain, he decided this is now the time. What time is it? It's time to invade Russia. Now, for 100 years, the German generals have always feared a 2-front attack. They knew that, one, because he was all right now, the west, on the east, nothing was happening. All was happening was on the Western Front. He was attacking all to the west. He didn't attack Russia. I mean, Poland was to the east, but Poland was not, this was like a plea, nothing. Now was time to turn to Stalin. What led Hitler, and I think this is important for us to understand, that he can actually take Russia. Well, why did he think that all of a sudden that he can actually beat Russia? Because of three crucial elements. Three crucial things happened. In 1938, Stalin, who was himself a madman, complete madman, purged the army. Why not? Because this happens every 10 years in the Soviet Union. Because you rise up, you don't trust anybody. So in 38, he absolutely purged the entire army. Got rid of all of the generals, got rid of the army generals, got rid of the naval generals, got rid of the admirals, completely. Hitler saw, you know what? Look at this. In 1938, he did him the biggest favor. He took all of the experienced soldiers and got rid of them. Step number one. Step number two was, in late 1939, Russia decides to invade Finland. Because a big threat to Russia, Finland. The Finnish were absolutely a big threat. But Russia always had scrimmages with Finland. So in 1939, Russia attacks Finland in the midst of all of this chaos. And you know what? The Finnish put up, Russia eventually beats Finland, but Finland puts up an unbelievable tough fight. And Hitler sees this. So here he is. He takes France, Belgium, Holland, Norway, Denmark, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Austria, with nary a fight, and the Russians have trouble with the Finns. Now, I don't know, there are great armies in the world, but I never knew that the Finns have one of the greatest armies. They held off the Russians. Ultimately, there was too much firepower, and they defeated the Finns. Hitler saw this, and he saw this as a tremendous weakness within the Russian army. So here you have two reasons. One, Stalin does him a favor and purges the army from its leadership. B, the Russians have a tough time fighting the Finns. Now if they're fighting the Finns, well, what about me? I'm going to do nothing. And C, Hitler believed that the communist system by itself was rotten to the core. So the moment he's going to attack Russia, it's going to collapse like a deck of cards. Just like we saw. Ultimately, we saw this when it was the Purple Revolution, when we didn't fire a shot. I mean, think about this in 1989, when Russia collapsed and the wall came down, how many shots were fired? 0. Yeltsin was sitting on a tank, I think, one morning in the Red Square, but in reality, the Russians fell apart. We didn't know that, but somehow it happened. But Hitler believed that the moment he was going to attack, Russia was going to absolutely fall apart. Hitler realized that the Russians had how many divisions? I think that he had counted on 15 to 20 good fighting divisions, and somehow they were going to be able to supplement with another maybe to 30 to 40,000 men. This was Hitler's estimation. Ultimately, Stalin was able to supplement with over 300,000 men. He grossly underestimated Stalin's power. He came to them the night before. He wanted to attack in January of 1941. But this is a very important lesson, ladies and gentlemen. You gotta be careful who your friends are. Be careful. Who was his biggest ally in Europe? Hitler's? Who? Mussolini. Mussolini was, as we say, I have nothing against the Italian people. They're probably very nice people who visit Italy. They like it. The food is good. Don't go with them in a war. You know what? In Bensonhurst, like Jackie Mason says, in Bensonhurst, the Italians are tough. When they come to Italy and fight a war, forget about it. Italy had trouble in Greece. They couldn't. So Hitler had to divert troops to back up Mussolini in Greece, which delayed him for 6 crucial months. 6 months, because he was planning to attack in January of 41. He had to postpone it. Finally, Operation Barbarossa took place on June the 22nd, 1941. Exactly, Hitler was a mastermind. 129 years to the day that someone else attacked Russia. Who was that? Napoleon. Absolutely, give this man another drink. All right? 129 years to the day that Napoleon attacked. The first week was an absolute disaster for the Russians. Hitler came charging in like he did with force. The Russians suffered unbelievable. 3-pronged attack Hitler went after Russia. A to the north in Stalingrad, B B to the center to Moscow, and C down to Kiev. In a matter of a week, there was unbelievable success on the Germans' part. They were cutting through Russia like it was nothing. But then eventually Stalin had pulled back. The siege of Stalingrad, which is Leningrad to Stalingrad to Petersburg, I mean every 2 weeks they changed the name, but I think in those days it was Stalingrad, lasted for 3 years. For 3 years, 900-day siege over Stalingrad. Literally millions of people in Russia died of starvation. But what Hitler's end is that he refused to give his soldiers even winter uniforms. He figured they're going to be finished, they'll be back home before the first frost. What happens? All of a sudden the winter hits them. Stalin pulls back to the outskirts of Moscow, and the Nazis are coming in. They stopped them. They stopped them. Wind and snow and rain begin to descend upon the Nazis in the winter, and then the hugest turning point in World War II. In December 7th of 1941, on a clear, nice blue day in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the Japanese attacked the United States of America. Now, what America's position in all of this was they were, of course, staunchly pro-Britain. And they supplied Britain with arms. And they supplied Britain with goods. And they supplied Britain with money. They had not sent over troops. They had not sent over troops. What happened was, and Hitler, as we mentioned before, had this vision that if America stays neutral, even if he takes the whole world, he doesn't care. Let America have. The Japanese, what did they say? Today, what did he say, the emperor? Today we awoke a sleeping giant. Right? The United States comes into the war. 4 days later, in December 11th, 1941, Hitler declares war on the United States of America. Okay? President Roosevelt was at that time the president, right? Was that his name? That's what Hitler kept referring to him as. The Jewish American President Roosevelt. Over and over again, he kept hammering home that Roosevelt. His name was Roosevelt, but I was not a Jew. He was from Hyde Park, New York, but not everybody from New York is Jewish. He was the one Gentile from New York that got elected, to the presidency. Okay, America comes into the war, and the tide of the war turns. Okay, Stalingrad bogs him down because now the Russians had not only been able to withstand the first assault, but they were able now to counter an assault. And America now sent over troops, and they decided, together with Britain and a few French soldiers, which under the leadership of our good friend, what was that tall guy? Charles de Gaulle decide they're going to go on a counter-offensive. They're going to counter an offensive. So in the years of 42 and 43, starting with the spring of 43, the Allies attack on several fronts. They invade North Africa. We all know Rommel. We all heard of the Nazi Northern Corps. Rommel was what they called the Desert Rat. He had fought the wars, the Desert Fox. The Desert Rat better. It was called the Desert Fox. The Desert Fox. He fought through Morocco and Tunisia and all of these places with the help of our good Mufti, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amayad, who was a tremendous Nazi sympathizer, and we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about the final solution of what was the Zionists organized what they call the British Brigade. We'll talk a little bit about them as well, that they fought on the side of the British. Rommel was an unbelievable tactician. He had literally taken the whole North Africa. Here came in the British, and they had counterattacked under the leadership of what they called Monty. We all know Monty, General Montgomery, and the little guy with the mustache, and all these fanciful guys. And this was the first counter-assault. The Americans attacked Sicily, and they came up the underbelly of Europe. Their plan was to cut through Italy, and by cutting through Italy, they were going to cut right into Germany, and that was going to be the counter-offensive. Britain started an air assault on Germany, and with American pilots and British pilots, they coordinated what America called the daylight precision bombing. American pilots would fly during the day, and they would bomb. They picked specific targets that they wanted to hit, munition depots, armament factories, all of these places where Americans would bomb. And when Americans would come back at night, Britain would bomb at night, indiscriminately. So what the Germans felt now in the cities like Dresden was constant 24-hour bombing. And they figured they're going to bomb the heck out of Germany. That was it, going to go all the way. They had not yet come onto the mainland. They were going to soften up Germany by bombing, and that was going to be it. So constant 24 hours a day. Bing, bang, boom, bang. And you see what happened to some cities. Berlin, after the war, looked like a war. Forget about it. It was not hardly a building standing in Berlin. In the big cities, this was a concentrated American-British war effort. And who was leading the American war effort? We all know it was Dwight David Eisenhower. He was what they call the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe. And MacArthur was fighting in the Far East, in the Far East, and so with Japan we'll leave out because we're really interested in more in Hitler. But Hitler was not about to give up yet. I mean, this was not a people that were going to take it sitting down. But Hitler became much more desperate right now. I mean, with the counteroffensive, and Russia decided also to counter. So they were going to cut right through, back right where Hitler came from, right through Poland into Poland, right into Germany. What should I tell you? 1944, June the 6th. I mean, anybody who ever seen the movie, I'm not telling you to go see movies, I'm not telling you to should go see movies, but Spielberg put out a movie that was called Saving Private Ryan. The story itself is Mehecha Tesa. The story itself is, you could believe, you could not believe, it's a movie, whatever, based on a true story, but the first 20 minutes of that movie is the most unbelievable, gruesome movie that you could possibly see. I mean, you are sitting at the edge of your seats and you're saying, oh my God, I can't believe this. Because what the Allies had decided, that already after the bombardment of Germany, that they were now going to land on the mainland, in Normandy, in France. This was called D-Day. Anybody that hasn't been living under a rock for the past 50 years know what D-Day is all about. D-Day was a massacre of a huge number of American, British forces landing on the beaches. They took 5 beaches. We know the most famous one was Omaha Beach because that was where they landed and they first set up the assault. But there were 5 other beaches along the coastline. Huge losses, because you're basically, like in the movie was saying, and this wasn't exaggerating, they came off, waded into the water, and the Germans were lined up in fortresses, literally gunning down American soldiers. But ultimately, they did establish a beachhead, and from there they started their assault onto the mainland and liberated France. Okay, they liberated France, and they ended up going into Germany. Hitler was not finished yet either. I mean, even with Russia attacking him from the east, the Americans and British already coming in on through France and up the belly through Italy. Hitler had one last offensive that he started at the end of December of 44 to try, and it lasted for about 5 weeks through January of 1945. He called up every single person from the ages of 16 to 60. Whoever could fight, move, walk, talk, anybody that could do anything, he took them into the army and he amassed them at the border of Belgium and France, by the Darnelle, if you're looking at the British map, and he tried to split. What he tried to do was he tried to split the American and the British forces in 2. Winston Churchill would coin this war called the Battle of the Bulge. It was called the Battle of the Bulge because he believed that the counterinsurgency, meaning how American and British were going to take him, was going to be like a huge bulge that they were going to push. They didn't end up doing that because he never even got off the ground. Americans were pinned down and he held them at bay for about 5 weeks, but ultimately it was over. And once America cracked through and defeated this counter attack in January of 45, the rest was just a matter of time. Slowly but surely, the infrastructure of the Nazi regime began to crumble. Americans and Russia now understood that they were now fighting for supremacy in Europe. And they tried, and unfortunately what they tried to do was try to, trip each other up, because they understood that as much as Stalin is going to grab, he's not giving back. So Stalin liberated Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, the 3 Baltic countries, which he basically took. Stalin liberated Yugoslavia, Germany, Czechoslovakia, not Germany, I'm sorry, Poland, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, East Germany, and basically this became later what we would know as the Warsaw Pact. I mean, it was and American and British forces began to take the rest. Russia, they said, when at this final battle that was racing towards Berlin, because both of them were going after the prize, I mean, they wanted to get Hitler. Patton, who was not known as a great Jew lover, I mean, our famous General Patton, I think he actually came here from Orange County, I believe. Grew up here in Orange County. But that doesn't say anything about the Orange County people, but I think he grew up here in Orange County. Told the United States Congress and the war machine that we need to now attack Russia. Once Hitler is defeated, let's go after Russia. America had suffered 500,000 casualties in World War II compared to Russia's 20 million casualties in World War II. So even 500,000 is a lot, but nothing compared to 20 million. The Russians, they said, when they sent the first counterinsurgency against the Germans, did not send Russian soldiers. It was interesting. What they did was they called up Russia at that time. The Soviet Union encompassed 15 different republics. You go back and look at the USSR, you see 15 different republics. What were some of the republics? You know the Mongols, you ever hear of Attila the Hun? You know why Attila the Hun was so feared? Because they had no pity. He took Mongols, they took people from, I'm trying to think of, there's Tartars, all of these people from the eastern edges of and they put them in front. They found after the war, German officers with their Gerglach, you know, this thing here, their throat, bitten out. That's the kind of revenge they took upon themselves. Why? Because when Hitler started Operation Barbarossa, which was his attack on the Soviet Union, he called in his generals. Now this is a very interesting point in history. And he told them this is not going to be a war like any other war. Even though Germany had signed the Geneva Convention, as I mentioned to you before, that there were certain ways how to deal with POWs, this was not going to be one of them. Hitler ordered that upon capture of any communist commissar, any capture of any Russian officer, any Jews, any gypsies should be immediately put to death without question, killed. That he understood that the German army wasn't going to be able to do that. So what did he do? He sent with the regular Russian army, he sent with SS commandos. Einsatzgruppen is what it was called. They took place in what Hitler called special assignment. And they were not responsible to report to the regular German commanders. They only reported to SS and to Himmler himself. And their job was to come in whenever they won a battle, whether it was a battle in Babi Yar, whether it was a battle in Kiev, wherever they won a battle, they would immediately take the Jews and assassinate them, the Russians, the officers, the commissars, the apparatchiks, all of these people would be killed immediately. They say, I don't know, and it's hard to gauge in history, but they said what this caused, because the German soldiers saw this. Now, I cannot judge what a 19-year-old German kid fighting in Russia is all about. But when they saw the SS Einsatzgruppen come in and line up women and children and old people, and you know what, like in Babi Yar, I think we mentioned Babi Yar last week someone had mentioned a book called Babi Yar. They killed 100,000 Jews, not like they killed in Auschwitz by burning them. They literally lined them up in a pit, and they would literally shoot mothers with babies in their hands. Many people say that this caused a tremendous weakening of morale among the German soldiers. Because until that time, you're fighting in the battle, okay, you wear a swastika, your commander is a Michiganer, okay, so we also agree that Patton was a bit of a Michiganer, right? You ever watched the movie Patton? You saw George Siegel's portrayal of this guy. He was a maniac, right? He was a crazy guy. So if you're a German 19-year-old, 20-year-old kid standing out there in Germany, you kind of think, okay, you know what? But you're removed from the horrors of genocide. You're removed this. You're fighting a war. You're fighting a war. But with the Einsatzgruppen, with the SS commandos that were fighting alongside of them, this they couldn't take. And Hitler understood that. That's why he sent the SS, because had he commanded the regular soldiers to do it, none of them could have pulled this off. But this was, so when the Russians understood this, and they saw that this was not a war that we fight, like you fight a normal war, you take prisoners of war, you exchange them, there's certain rules and regulations. But the gloves were off in the counter-offensive that Russia was then going to unleash. And you don't have to give Stalin any ideas, because he himself was a madman of the greatest proportion. I mean, anybody that could kill 20 million of his own countrymen, you don't have to give him any ideas of brutality. Trust me, you didn't have to send him a book on the Marquis de Sade. He couldn't write a book on the Marquis de Sade, because he killed everybody around him, Stalin. And then when the killers got finished, he killed the killers and then killed the killers' killers. He killed everybody around. So when they launched a counter-offensive against the Germans, they sent in the cruelest, the meanest, the most aggressive people. So by the time they got, and when they got close to Warsaw, and they were fighting within Germany, who did they put in the front lines? The Polish partisans. Why? Because the Polish partisans, they knew, hated the Germans with such a hatred that it wasn't going to be like, you know what, I'm going to take this guy captive. Absolute brutality on both sides of the fence. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, it wasn't only the Russians and the Germans that were acting brutal. This was an unbelievable brutal war. Unbelievable brutal. I don't want to say Americans had no brutality, because I'm sure there was on all sides that, you know, this was. I mean, you could imagine Jewish soldiers fighting and meeting a Nazi. I mean, how could you, knowing exactly what went on, how could you control yourself? And many couldn't control, and there's stories afterwards that, you know what, Jewish men went into POW camps, German POW camps, and literally killed the German soldiers. I mean, there's stories, many stories that we find after the war that we kind of don't talk about. My mother was liberated by the British in Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945. The British were very proper. I mean, they came the morning of the end of the war. They opened up the concentration camps. Now, how did my mother know the war was over? Because many times what the Nazis used to do in Auschwitz was they used to hide in the towers. They would wake up in the morning and there were no guards there. So they figured, no guards there, okay, let's make a run for it. As soon as they got to the fences, the guards would pop up and then automatically shoot them down. This is the mentality of the German Nazi beasts. That morning, they already heard that there was fighting going on, but where are you going to go? You know, they all weighed about 90 pounds, 80 pounds, 90 pounds. They were weak, so they sat there in the morning. Inside of Bergen-Belsen, there was gypsies together with the Jewish women in this compound. The gypsies, they had a different mentality. They ran away. The moment they saw no guards, they got up in the morning and they took off. My mother and the rest of the Jewish women sat there. They're not moving. They don't care. They could have sat there till today. They weren't going to move. That night in the evening, the British rolled in. When the British rolled in, they were very proper to the Jews. I mean, you know, Britain, very proper people. The army came in. There weren't many Jews among the British soldiers. They were proper. The first thing my mother ate was spam. Spam. They had these little boxes. They had these little containers of, you know, meat and other stuff. Now, my mother hadn't eaten a meal since 1939. So this is 1945 in April. They opened up the spam, they ate, whatever it is. A lot of the people got,
Very sick.
They got sick. My mother ended up in the hospital. My aunt ended up in the hospital. Yeah, who knows? And your stomach is not accustomed to eating, and all of a sudden you get this. Auschwitz was liberated by the Americans. Americans already had a different experience. Many of them were Jewish soldiers. Not many, but there were some Jewish soldiers. That was different. I mean, the whole completely different situation. Within Berlin itself, Hitler had already moved in for 6 months into his bunker. It's too bad they didn't capture him alive. I mean, but on April 30th, Hitler committed suicide and had his body burnt. There's a lot of speculation, there's conspiracy theorists and all this thing that he did die, he didn't die, his secretary is an eyewitness that he did die and that they did burn him, that he didn't burn him. Many of the Nazis were captured. Göring was captured. We all know with the Nuremberg trials, but Göring committed suicide. He had cyanide. Other Nazi leaders were captured, but Hitler himself, in 12 years, all it was 12 short men. 12 years is nothing, in the history of the world if you think about it. From 1933, January of 33, to April of 1945, Hitler literally was responsible for the death of over 50 million people in the world. Not only the death of 50 million people in the world, Hitler had reconfigured the entire globe. Absolutely everything. Japan was, he caused a nuclear war. Hitler was the only one that actually caused a nuclear war. The 2 bombs on in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, they defeated the Japanese. It was unbelievable. The world went into an actual Cold War because the Russians weren't going to get along with the Americans. Americans weren't going to get along with the Russians. World War II had ended. When World War II ended, the world the shock to the system was unbelievable because no one could realize. Most Americans living in the United States felt the brunt only because either through newsreels or through other things. Not many people actually went overseas to fight. Not many people were actually at Pearl Harbor, so they only saw the war peripherally. For example, I'll give you an example. My mother came to Canada in 1948 after making a small detour to Sweden. My father came, same year. They married, had a family. My father had an aunt that came to Canada in 29. Okay? One day, I was too little to remember this, but my mother kept retelling me this story. One day, my great aunt, who I called my grandmother because there was no other grandparents around, I used to call her Bubishi, my sister called her Bubishi. My mother was talking about the war, what she had gone through, that the Nazis had come in and they took their whole family. And my great aunt, innocently, this was not maliciously, says to her, you know what, we also had it tough. We had to wait online to buy chicken. Okay? This is what my great aunt tells my mother. My mother says to me and my sister that she literally laid in bed for a week. She couldn't get out of bed, she was so depressed. This hurt her so much to think that this lady kind of understood a little bit of what was going on. This was already after the war. This is after the pictures had already been shown. Those you can't even call them people because they were skeletons. If you look at the concentration camp afterwards, these are not human beings. You look at them, their eyes don't have any sight. Their ears have no hearing. They're literally ghosts. You saw the people with the ribs sticking out. They came out with the blankets. This is a human being. This is a scarecrow. This is like an out of space movie, and who knows what this was. And these people who thought that the world at least kind of understood them, there was no way to really understand what was going on. Why do we talk about this? Because it hurts, it's painful. You talk about the death of 50 million people. 50 million people and one beast, or maybe a few beasts. Why do we talk about it? Because I think that intolerance doesn't go away. It rears its ugly head. Here in the United States, we've never had a Holocaust. And God willing, we never will have a Holocaust. But if you read the early writings of our founding fathers, they had absolutely no compunction about keeping slaves. Even the great Thomas Jefferson, who we hold in greatest esteem, the man who built the wall of church and state that's so unpregnable, almost, had no problem keeping slaves. Had no problem whatsoever. And slavery was only abolished 1865, 140 years ago. So 140 years removed from actually Americans keeping slaves. So we know that intolerance and hatred of other people is just below the surface. Just below the surface. And I think that it's incredibly important to keep reiterating the fact. Now, whether this can happen again or not can happen again, it doesn't make a difference whether a Nazi could rise up here in the United States. But intolerance all started If you remember the first part of this, it all started by a small gang of devoted racists. That's all it was. It was a small gang led by a madman with a vision and a tremendous willpower to make this succeed. Now, did he have a lot of luck? Yes. He had luck because a depression came in. He had luck because the German people already were down and out looking for some kind of savior. He had a luck that he had Neville Chamberlain and not who knows who standing up against him during the Munich Peace Conference and during the early part of the 1930s. All of these things worked in his favor. When he attacked Poland, nary a word. Yes, that all helped him achieve. But it all started not with 100 million people rising up. A small group of people led by a madman with a plan. That's all it was. We didn't see it. No one recognized it. Not the German people, not the Americans. We had great statespeople at that time. British are not dumb people. They're very brilliant people. They had an entire empire. France are not retarded people. Okay, it's running. The video camera's running. They're very nice people. Everybody, these are not crazy people. Yet they couldn't stop this man. And this proves to me, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it doesn't have to happen again. Another Hitler doesn't have to happen. But what could happen is intolerance rears its ugly head. And that's why I think it's of utmost importance to keep reiterating and talking about this. Besides the fact that we as Jews have a responsibility of keeping alive the memory of the 6 million. God bless them. The people that survived the Holocaust. Holocaust survivors. Listen, without them I wouldn't be here tonight. That's for sure. But slowly but surely, may it be for many years, but we know that there's a time limit here. I mean, they're not getting any younger. They should live to 120. But even if they live to 120, that's not that far off. We are the people that need to say, now I know a lot of people say, yeah, come on, Rabbi, you talk about the Holocaust. You know what, that's no way to sell Yiddishkeit. Talking about negative things like the Holocaust. Who wants to be burdened with this burden by saying, you know what, you have to be Jewish because 6 million people died, and if you don't do it, you're a traitor to your cause. No one likes to buy that. I mean, especially the young people. Even my children don't have the same feeling as I have. I mean, I'm already one step removed, and they're 2 steps removed. So they look at my mother and my father, and they look at them, and it's very nice just to hear the stories, but they don't have the same feeling like I have. And their children down the line only grow up in the greatness of the United States of America. We need to not sell Judaism with depression about the Holocaust, but we definitely should never forget the sacrifice, because Hitler, as we mentioned last week, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next lesson, and we talk about the Holocaust itself, Hitler's final solution was a kind of anti-Semitism that had never been seen before. Racial anti-Semitism had never come into play. We were used to religious anti-Semitism. Yeah, okay, the Catholics hated us, the Protestants hate us, but this kind of racial anti-Semitism was something unique and new to the Jewish people. And no one wanted to believe that this could happen, and it happened. And we have to be vigilant, because to quote the great professor, that we are those who don't learn by history are condemned to repeat it. And in this day and age, we see that hatred is not gone. We thought that after World War II, we built the United Nations. We thought this is going to be the war to end all wars. Who wants to go through this again? Who wants to see the devastation? Who wants to see the destruction, the loss of life, the loss of limb, people losing families, loved ones, brothers, uncles, fathers, sons? Who wants to? Yet, if you look around the world, you see that we haven't learned anything. We've learned absolutely nothing, and on the contrary, I think from September 11th, we learned a big lesson in this country that hatred of the United States still exists. You know what was the biggest shock in America? The biggest shock was not the loss of 3,000 lives. No. People saw 3,000 lives. It was a shocker because, first of all, they were talking about 50,000 lives. So early in the morning, they were saying, oh my God, the Twin Towers are up to 50,000 people. But as the days went on and they started to figure out how many, that was not the biggest shock in America. The biggest shock is, why us? I'm living in Dover, Delaware. I'm living in Ogden, Utah. I'm living in Port Arthur, Texas. I'm an American who goes to work every single day building cars in a little factory somewhere in Tennessee. What do I have to do with Al Qaeda? I know Osama bin Laden. What am I? I'm not a poor guy, but I'm a laborer that puts together Volvos. I screw into screws. Why is bin Laden attacking me? What does he have against me? Here's a poor guy living in Peoria, Illinois. Who's a dairy farmer. All the guy does is wakes up in the morning and milks his cow, with a big hat and a deer truck. He's living the life of Riley, never a worry, and all of a sudden he wakes up September 11th, and flashed across the screen is people declared war on the United States of America. They were chasing our president around. The president of the United States of America, I don't care who it was, whether it was Bush, Clinton, Thomas Jefferson, Pierce, or Lincoln, it doesn't make a difference. Air Force One was in a panic. They were flying here, flying there, back and forth, here. They had the president of the United States on the run. About 15 terrorists had the president, this most powerful person, on the run. And the Americans woke up and said, why us? What do we have to do about it? I have something to do. Guy in a cornfield in Pennsylvania, Amish in Pennsylvania, the Mormons of Utah, the surfers of California. Ladies and gentlemen, hatred doesn't need a reason. They hate us because they hate us. That's what it is, because we represent something to them that they could never ever have, and that is called freedom. And that's what all freedom-loving people hate. And if we stand over here and we say, why us? What's that? I'm a nice guy. I don't bother anybody. Do we ever raise up here and attack a mosque? Did anybody here in this room ever spray paint a mosque? No? Did anybody here ever attack a Muslim, a Christian? As a matter of fact, did anybody here ever attack a Jew? Shul once, I'm telling you. No? And nobody. Yet, we can't understand why us. We're nice people. You know why? Because they hate us. That's the way it is. For absolutely no reason. Because we represent something that they in a million years cannot have, and they want it. They want it. You want to wake up in the morning. You want to be able to go out into the thing and say, you know what, Bushes are no good, like a paskunyak. Who could say that in the world? You think in 1939 in Germany you could get up and say Hitler was a paskunyak? You think you could get up in 1950 and say Stalin was a paskunyak? You want to get up in 1940 and say Mao Zedong is a fat, stupid, ugly-looking leader? No, you couldn't do this. 3/4 of the world was under oppression. Only here in the United States. We were the beacon of light to the entire world. And that causes tremendous angst to people that hate this kind. You know what? If you want to walk around with a tattoo from the top of your head to your pipik, nobody could say anything here in the United States. You walk around with a tattoo with no shirt. Now sometimes I see these guys, with the, what do you call those? The body piercing. And boy, it freaks me out. You see them like you go to walk on Huntington Beach in the pier and you see these guys with ears down here and then in the nose and the eyebrows, in the back of the head, in the tuchus, in the back. Who knows everywhere it is. It's unbelievable. You know what? To me, it's obnoxious. But you know what, my friends? This is why we live in the United States of America. That's what it's all about. And let's make no mistake that we need to be vigilant in this. Now, I don't want to get into politics because this is not what this class is all about. That you could take in your political science classes. But absolutely everybody agrees that we need to do our utmost to keep this country free, safe, because if it's not going to be us, it's going to be nobody in the world. Because we are the last bastion of this kind of freedom to the world. And I don't want to make it sound dramatic, but that's the truth, ladies and gentlemen. That is the absolute truth. That the one thing that's standing in the way is us. And we're not going to give up because, you know what? Because we know that God is on our side. That's for sure. God is definitely on our side, bar nothing. And we should always remember that and do whatever we can to ensure that we keep this country free and clear and liberated, and as the Constitution says, not the Constitution, of the people, for the people, by the people. God bless America. Thank you. What? Including, yeah, you know what? I tell you, I will turn off the camera if there's any questions.
Yeah.
All right. Why am I not surprised? Go ahead.
The term
Yeah.
I know exactly what
it means.
What it means.
Yeah.
It makes reference to ugly people.
Right.
Paskudnyak, is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Can you give a better definition of it?
You know what? I was called Paskunyak a number of times in my youth. What? That's a no good Nick, a bum. Someone that you wouldn't want to give a compliment to. And you could say it for anybody. I mean, believe me, when Clinton was in office, they said he's a Paskunyak. When Bush is in office, they say he's a Paskunyak. I mean, a Paskunyak. But there's no, you know what, Mel? In Yiddish, there's certain terms that you could not describe. There's just certain words that are it's impossible. They're only Yiddish, and they remain in the Yiddish lexicon. It's hard to pair.
D-Day.
Yes.
Was there any other tactic considered? Because they knew there would be huge casualties. I mean, this may not be something that you can answer, but I could never understand why they had to go where they had to go.
Listen, I tell you, it's a good question. You have to ask military theorists, what the idea was. But I don't know if they believed. I don't know, A, if they had anticipated this amount of casualties on the beaches itself, A. B, they needed a beachhead to land. I mean, you got to figure where, you're going to cut through somewhere. You got to go through somewhere, and you got to make a stand. And probably this was, but I don't know if they had already. I mean, you have to look this up and read the war chronicles, of Eisenhower, or of Churchill and all of these guys, who planned D-Day. But I'm not so sure that they had anticipated the kind of casualties that they encountered, that day. I mean, you're willing to lose some men, but everybody's got to lose some men, during a battle. But I don't know if they were willing to lose that many, but so be it. War is hell. There's no other definition for it. No matter where they were fighting, whether they were fighting through Italy, or whether they were fighting, on Omaha Beach, or whether they were coming into Russians, or whether they were fighting in Iwo Jima. I mean, these were kids, kids that had no vested interest in this. They were kids from Oklahoma, kids from Iowa, kids from Wyoming and North Dakota who didn't know how to spell Hitler. They didn't know about Hitler. You had, Italian guys from Bensonhurst, and you had Southern boys from Alabama. But I think that the one thing that World War II did versus the other wars that America subsequently did fight, whether it was in Korea or whether it was in Vietnam or whether it was nothing, I think there was stark contrasts here. I mean, it was very clear who was the enemy. There was no moral dilemmas here. There wasn't like, should we be there? This was a total evil person, and our job was to eradicate evil from the world. Versus, take an example, on the other completely end of the spectrum was Vietnam. Now, unless you were you're one of these soldiers, no questions asked, you go, you're in the military. Ours is not to question why, ours is but to do and die. You go. But to many of them, and there was a draft during the Vietnam War, we all remember the draft, and they sent everybody from all over. The war made no sense. What are we doing here? What are we? I mean, we're protecting whom? A corrupt South Vietnamese government? I mean, a dictator? A guy? Who are we killing? I mean, people against brother, and the war was to many immoral, and certainly didn't have the support back home. And that's so I think in World War II, we're willing to take the casualties. We're willing. Now, had CNN, right, that's a good one. Had CNN been around then, and had CNN been traveling with Patton's army, and had they been on the beaches, of D-Day and seen American soldiers being gunned down, maybe it would be different. But I think in the minds of the people back home, except for the isolationists, I think in the minds, we already had in our psyche agreed that he was evil, that he needed to be destroyed. And we were willing to take the casualties versus Vietnam, which again, I do admit that Vietnam was already a television fought war. I mean, you had Dan Rather and Walter Cronkite and these guys over there in Vietnam, and you saw every day, which you don't see now. the body bags coming in off the things. And, you know, it was a completely different kind of a war where, you know, we didn't see what our interests there were. So, you know, but I think in World War II it was kind of stark, you know.
Hitler controlled what the people saw on the news, though. I mean, I remember going to Ration,
Yeah.
and the tour guide told us that when the Red Cross came in to see how the Jews were living,
Oh, yeah, Tresenstadt. I mean, they built that. They built that as a PR compound, and people
was
said,
that the case
yeah,
all across Europe that Hitler controlled.
yeah, of course.
So we saw what Hitler wanted us to see here.
But yeah, I mean, and part of it was true. Part of it which Cayman Americans didn't realize. But we do have an independent media, and we did have a president that got up there every day to announce to the country that we are fighting and we're in this war and Hitler is an animal. So I mean, Americans were fed a good part of their own propaganda, you know, against the Nazis. I mean, that they were fed. So I mean, I think that we understood clearly that even though we didn't know the details of the Holocaust. If you went to 1944 and asked a guy, you know, somewhere in South Carolina, you know, what's going on in Auschwitz, I don't know if he thought, but he knew that Hitler's a no-goodnik. Hitler's anti-American, and he's destroying us, and we had Pearl Harbor. I mean, they had bombed Pearl Harbor, so we saw already the Axis were our enemies. And that made it easier to send over soldiers. No.
Well, the movie industry during the Second World War was pro-war because it was all propaganda.
Yeah, exactly.
The movie industry now is independent, or whatever you want to call it.
Right. Which is you know, used to, and you saw movies like Charlie Chaplin had made movies absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Go ahead.
I've heard something on TV that there was really no good reason to bomb the Japanese cities at all with the atom bomb. No reason at all.
Oh, no.
Oh, that's not.
No. You know what? I'll tell you. Listen. You know what? The advantage is here that we are sitting 60 years removed from the event. Now, were there other ways that we could have subdued the Japanese? Sure, we could have fought a dragged out war and lost many other hundreds or maybe thousands of soldiers and eventually subdued them. But you know what? No one realized and no one knew what the power of the atomic bomb was. We would know that, and it had never been dropped anywhere. It had never been dropped anywhere. So Truman, when he decided to drop it, figured, you know, this is a big bomb, baby. This is going to get the message across. But again, I didn't realize.
But it didn't. After Hiroshima, the Japanese war
Effort.
people decided to continue the war.
Right, no, yeah.
4 days later, after
Nagasaki, they decided.
No, the Japanese military decided to continue the war, and then finally the emperor said, okay, time out, we're done.
We're finished.
But the military had decided to continue the war, and we didn't have a third bomb.
There you go. There you go.
That bomb saved 1.25 million Americans.
Easy.
And 300 million Japanese. But
Wow.
you went up.
Yeah, they would have killed
I
us.
agree. I mean, there's no argument here. There's no argument here. Absolutely not.
And you cannot disregard it, no matter what anybody says.
No, absolutely.
What they-
No.
what-
But you know how historians are. Historians will look back, and no matter what decision you're going to make, there's always going to be critics. There's going to be. On the one hand you have here, on the other hand I have 5 fingers. You know, I mean that's the way it is. So you know what, you can't. It's hard to sit. I mean, every action by every country is going to be analyzed, dissected, looked at. You know, why? I tell you, sitting and researching this, you have to ask yourself every step of the way. What if? What if? I mean, what if someone would have put a bullet in his head? They tried before, they tried during, they tried afterwards. None of them were successful. What if? What if his mother would have had an abortion? You know, what if? You know, I mean, that itself gives me, I'm pro-abortion. If we get one Hitler, you know, like over there, just to get him out. But you can't ask. But that doesn't stop people from debating, and it doesn't stop people from inquiring, it doesn't stop people from speculating. Go ahead.
Well, the other thing that's scary, I imagine, is today, well, there's always psychopaths or crazy people who want to gain power, and they can look back and see, look what Hitler did in such a short time, and they learn from him, but they figure they have to do it differently because you know, the whole world is a little more aware, but the whole world also
No,
knows now that everybody hates the Jews. It's underneath, maybe coming out a little more.
Listen, today we have one huge advantage that we did not have in 1939. It is called the State of Israel. The State of Israel, even though that we sometimes rely too much on the army, because in Israel the attitude is, Tzahal will take care of it. No matter what our problem is, the army will take care of it. So sometimes we rely too much on the strength of the army. But as Moshe Ahrens, the former defense minister in Israel, once said, because Israel has always denied having nuclear arms. They've never admitted to having any kind of nuclear arms. They will not participate in any nuclear treaty. Israel has never signed on into any non-proliferation treaties because they know that's the death sentence for them. But they've never admitted to having the bomb either. So Moshe Ahrens once said, they once asked him, Minister Ahrens, will Israel be the first to use nuclear warheads in a war? So he said, Israel will not be the first, but we won't be the third either. Okay? That's it. Won't be the first, but we won't be the third either. And Israel, thank God, so far has been able to withstand. And had we had Israel in 1939 or 29 or 19, who knows what would have happened. Again, it's all speculation. But today it's a different world. It's scarier in a way because somebody somewhere down the line will get the bomb. I mean, to me, it's just a matter of time. Whether it's in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, they're going to figure out, some bad people will figure out how to get a hold of these hugely devastating things. And then who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what's going to happen? Believe me, we unleashed in World War II a monster. I mean, it was he absolutely said it correctly that we saved millions of lives, but what we opened up is a can of worms that we're never going to be able to put back. We think we're going to stop Iran from getting the bomb. I mean, Pakistan has the bomb, Israel has the bomb, everybody has the bomb. So Iran is going to get the bomb sooner or later, and a bunch of crazy people running the government. Who knows what could happen? You know, it's scary to think about it.
Has any word come down from the rabbis regarding the movie Munich?
It hasn't even come out yet.
What's the movie?
The movie is Munich. It hasn't even come out yet. A few people have seen it. The Times has written about it. The Times had an article today about it. Just today, the Times had an article about it.
New York Times?
No, the LA Times. The LA Times had an article about it. And some people who saw the movie, I mean, he's showing, of course, now selected screenings throughout the country. So you know what? How can I say this so it won't offend anybody? But when our enemies like the movie, it might be a problem. So that's all. I don't know, but it had favorable reviews by people that we would not give favorable reviews to Schindler's List. I can tell you that much. Now, where Spielberg is going with this movie, I have no idea. I haven't seen it, so it's hard to judge. But just speculating on what I've heard through the grapevine, is of course he went out on a limb this time. Why? Because what he basically did was told a story of the Mossad from a human perspective. Now, the Mossad are human beings. The Mossad were given a mission to eliminate, to me, 11 murderers. 11 murderers, nothing more, nothing less of innocent people. Now that Spielberg portrays them as having angst and having, moral, being human, and what are we doing, and violence begets violence, and violence. You can imagine that that's going to open up a can of worms in a certain amount of population, because every time Jews hear that this is a war of moral equivalency, that every time there's a suicide bombing, all of a sudden Israel comes in with the army and they squash. So look, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I'm not neutral on this subject. I can't be neutral on this subject. To me, Israel is everything and everything is Israel. But when you look at the LA Times, and the LA Times portrays this picture with no caption, you see 12-year-old kids behind the wall like this with rocks, and you see armed people from the head to the toes with flak jackets, with guns, standing like this. What are you going to say? What is going to be embedded in your mind? You're going to say that Israel uses much more harsh things. If you can't kill a 12-year-old kid for throwing a rock. It's an innocent kid, a 12-year-old kid. To me, I've never bought into that moral equal. Golda Meir said, and someone quoted it today in the paper, and they said, Golda Meir says, you know what? We could forgive the Arab for killing our children, but we'll never forgive the Arab for turning our children into killers. Okay? And think about that for a second. We could forgive the Arabs for killing our children, but we'll never forgive them for turning our children into killers. So you take a 19, 18-year-old Israeli soldier, think he's not scared out there? Think you send him to Jenin, you send him to Tikrit, or to all these other places. I mean, not Tikrit, that's in Iraq, but in those three towns near Netanya, in Shechem and all these places. You think he's not scared? He's petrified. I got two sons. One is 19 and one is 20, and I know both of my sons would be today in the Israeli army. I look at them, these two pishers. They're two pishers in my estimation, and they would be going around with arms. Yeah, they're trained. Of course they're trained, but they're scared out of their wits. So to me, there's no moral equal. There's no moral. There's a suicide attack, so Israel retaliates. No, Israel retaliates because we've given the olive branch enough times, and there's no one to talk to. Absolutely no one on the other side of the peace table. Never been, and in the future, I don't see anybody sitting on the other side. We are willing to make peace. Israel has shown it over and over again. We are willing to give up land to the detriment of our own best security. Our own generals say we're crazy for giving up land, but we're willing to give up land. We're willing to give them a state. As long as we know for sure that we're going to be living in peace, our mothers go to sleep at night with a peaceful head. Have we seen any success in this? No, the only guy that we were able to deal with was Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat, according to Abba, even was a man that never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Every opportunity he was able to miss. Now you have a guy, Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas is a man that's a Holocaust denier. Right? He denied the Holocaust. Okay, so we have a problem to start off with. Then you have guys in the Hamas who still today openly say that their goal is to destroy the state of Israel. Now, am I missing something? What? And the winning. So am I missing something in this? What am I missing over here? Well, I mean, if we had a guy today in the United States of America that ran for office on the platform of bringing down the United States. This is his platform. He's an anarchist. His goal is, and his objective is to bring down, to destroy the Constitution and to bring down the government of the United States. What would be the reaction? But we allow these people to run for office. We supply them with arms. We supply them with money. We give them everything. We gave them the Gaza. And yet the world is looking at us like who knows what. So I think that was a long answer to a question about Munich. So I think that in this instance, when Spielberg portrays, it's a tit for tat, that they hit us, so we're going to now slam them, and then the Mossad agents are going to be, depicted as guys sitting in a bar and, what are we doing? It's terrible. I mean, they're people, and he portrays the terrorists and anything else for that matter. You want to go see E.T.? Fine. I saw Schindler's List. The guy did a tremendous job. I mean, I had lived with this my entire life, and after seeing the film, there was absolute dead silence for 10 minutes in the studio. No one moved, and I was not sitting with only Jews. There were many Gentiles. Nobody moved. It's an unbelievable filmmaker. Yes, he portrayed that story of the Holocaust beautifully, but he's not the end all and say all of every issue, and he doesn't speak for the Jewish people. They're just like Marvin Heyer and Abe Foxman of the ADL, who think that they speak for the Jewish people. They think they speak for it. They didn't speak for me when they attacked Mel Gibson's movie Passion of the Christ. They didn't ask me my opinion, because I would have said, be quiet. All you're doing is giving him tremendous amount of publicity for nothing. I always felt that Mel Gibson is a thief. Why is he a thief? He should have taken $25 million from his $300 million that he made and presented a check to Marvin Heyer, because he gave him at least $25 million worth of publicity. He should have given the ADL $50 million, because he gave them $50 million worth of publicity, for free. And that was that. So not Abe Foxman speaks for the Jewish people, not Marvin Heyer, and certainly not Steven Spielberg. We are independent-minded people that make our own decisions. Only I speak for the Jewish people. That's it. Finish. And if you don't like it, you could lump it. Finish. That's the way it works in this world. I'm the man, and I might make the final decisions, for the Jews. Well, so never, go ahead.
I was at a cultural event the other day. I'm an usher at a theater.
Yeah.
And sometimes the ushers stand around and chat. And there was a very intelligent gentleman there, a new usher. And he was talking and had some very interesting things to say. And I don't know how he got on the subject, but he said, you know what causes war? I said, no, what causes war? He said, it's countries that have conscription, like Israel. So I said, a hack was and I said, I beg to differ with you. I said, Israel is surrounded by people that put no value on human life. And then he started ranting a little bit, and I think, you know what? The bell is going to ring any minute, the doors are going to open, I have to go to the door.
Right. Yeah.
What would you say to somebody like that?
I would say, listen, the facts and history are not on your side. That's like the facts, if you open up your eyes, if you're an intelligent person, go read the history books and you will see that on May 15th, 1948, Israel declared its independence. In November of 47, the United Nations, by a majority vote, split, partitioned Palestine and gave half to Israel and half to the Arabs. It was even clear. On May 15th, Israel declared its independence. On May 16th, not 24 hours afterwards, 5 Arab countries came and wanted to destroy Israel. Israel had 3 planes. There were 3 people in the Air Force. Ezer Weitzman and 2 other guys, and they lost 1 and 1. So who started the war? We had no conscription then. We had hardly an army. We had a Palmach, with a Lehi, with a Haganah. We had 5 or 6 different fighting groups that didn't know what was going on, one with the other, Begin and Ben-Gurion, and Begin, and everybody was... So who? Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, came and attacked us and wanted to destroy us. And from that moment, read the charter of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. That's all you need to read. Just read their charter, that they are there for the destruction of the state of Israel. Now, if Canada, which is our most friendly neighbor up north, had in its charter that they are out to destroy the United States, it wouldn't take 5 minutes and American troops would be sitting in Ottawa and blowing up the Prime Minister so sky high they wouldn't know what happened. What are you talking about? When I grew up as a kid, this is Canada, forget about the Middle East. Canada, 1970, I'll never forget it. Was I born in 70? Yeah, I was born in 70, yeah. What are you laughing, Pierre? Oh, okay. So 1970, I wake up in the morning in Montreal, there's Canadian troops standing in the streets, half tracks riding down, and this is Montreal. What happened? There was this little group called the FLQ, Fédération de Libération du Québec. They wanted to liberate Quebec, because Quebec was a very, very racist state against the French. So they kidnapped a minister of the provincial government called Pierre Laporte, and they killed him. Tanks came rolling in for one guy. So think about when you're a little country surrounded by 22 Arab states, 5 million Jews surrounded by 300 million Arabs who are out to get you. You tell me what to do. You ask him about his family. If your family was surrounded by people who wanted to destroy, what would you do? You'd lay down and die? Fine, so that's good for you. We're not into suicide. 6 million did it enough in World War II. We ain't laying down anymore, never again.
Well, the topper of this is,
Yeah.
I said to the head usher that,
Yeah.
I said, what's that guy's name?
Yeah.
His last name is Golub, G-O-L-U-B.
But that could be anything.
Well, I know.
That could be, we have friends call them.
But
We have a good number of
I
our-
just wondered.
Yeah, but you know what? Listen, it's an irrational thing. People who don't like Israel don't like Israel. You don't have to go to the Arabs. We have a Professor Noam Chomsky.
Yes.
That is the biggest hater of Israel in the United States, and he hates the United States. So what do? We make a professor at MIT.
We give them ratings. radio time.
And we give him radio time and we pay him and this and that, because you know why? This is the United States of America. So you might not agree with Noam Chomsky, you might not agree with anybody else, but this is the freedom of the marketplace. And what we have to do is keep clamoring and shouting enough to shout down on Noam Chomsky and to educate the people that he is truly a self-hating Jew, totally a self-hating Jew, and then we have to win the hearts and minds of the American public, which I think for most part we do have. I mean, I think I think most Americans are pro-Israel, but nonetheless, we can't ever sit back and be complacent. You just can never sit back and be complacent. We think just because members of Congress are pro-Israel and members of the Senate, you got to be vigilant every step of the way. The moment we let down our guard, we got hit like 9/11, and then we wonder what happened. Okay, any other questions? No? Thank you very much.